They had been told a story their entire lives. That surrender was shameful. That the Americans would beat them, starve them, perhaps even kill them on sight. For Japanese soldiers captured in the Pacific, the moment of surrender was not just the end of battle, it felt like the end of honor itself. On transport ships bound for the United States, men whispered in the dark about what awaited them. Some imagined prison pits, others pictured starvation camps. A few even wondered if they would ever see sunlight again. And yet, when those ships touched American soil, the first steps of captivity brought not cruelty, but confusion. Instead of whips and fists, they were handed paperwork. Instead of being thrown into filthy cells, they were marched in lines, disciplined, orderly, processed like soldiers rather than criminals. Then came the first shock. Food. Not scraps, not mouldy rice, but bread still warm from the oven. Coffee, strong and bitter. Sometimes even a slice of meat. For men who had lived for months on jungle rations, it was unthinkable. Nothing about this matched the warnings of their commanders. The fences and barbed wire were real, yes, but inside the camps were wooden barracks, mess halls, even places marked for recreation. Some camps had libraries, others had baseball fields. The air carried the scent of soap, a smell almost forgotten in the rotting jungles of the Pacific. The contradictions piled higher each day. Doctors inspected wounds. Guards spoke sternly but without cruelty. And everywhere order. Order in the meals, in the medical checks, even in the way prisoners were told to wash and shave. For Japanese soldiers who had been taught that strength meant surviving filth and hunger, this discipline of cleanliness was bewildering. How could the enemy, supposedly soft and decadent, run their camps with such precision? How could men who slept on clean sheets, shaved every morning, and wore mended uniforms still win wars across two oceans? This was the beginning of a story almost never told. A story not of battles or bombings, but of the small human details of captivity. The sting of hot water in a communal shower, the hum of electric clippers in a barber's chair, the shock of freshly laundered sheets. These routines may seem trivial today, but for men who expected only humiliation, they became moments of revelation, moments that forced them to question everything they had been taught about war, about honor, and about America itself. And so, in the quiet order of these camps, another kind of battle unfolded. Not one of bullets and bayonets, but of ideas, perceptions, and survival. 1. Expectations of surrender. Death before dishonor. For Japanese soldiers, surrender was not simply losing a battle, it was erasing yourself from honor, from family, even from memory. From the first day of training, recruits were told that capture was worse than death. The imperial army drilled into them the belief that to lay down arms was to abandon their ancestors, their emperor, and their very humanity. Commanders often repeated the ancient phrase, "Better to die like a shattered jewel than live as an unbroken tile." To the men, that meant choosing death over humiliation. In the caves of Saipan and the cliffs of Okinawa, soldiers and even civilians leapt to their deaths rather than fall into enemy hands. Examples of this indoctrination were everywhere. Soldiers carried grenades not only for the battlefield, but as a final escape, turning them on themselves if capture became inevitable. At Bataan and Guadalcanal, Americans were stunned to find bodies of Japanese troops who had chosen suicide over surrender. Survivors were often shunned by their own comrades, branded as weaklings who had failed the code of sacrifice. So when capture finally came, the weight was crushing. Imagine being one of those men, knowing that your family back home might never accept you again. Many prisoners feared not only American cruelty, but the eternal shame that would linger long after the war. Some even prayed for storms to sink their transport ships before they reached US soil, believing drowning at sea would be more honorable than living in captivity. This mindset mattered. It shaped every first impression, every rumor, every fearful glance among the men as they marched off the transport ships. They were not walking into a camp as soldiers who had lost. They believed they were walking into a shadow existence, cut off from dignity. And yet, here lies the quiet lesson. The harshest prisons are sometimes built inside the mind. Long before barbed wire and guard towers surrounded them, Japanese POWs carried invisible chains of shame and fear. What they expected from America was not life, but the slow confirmation of their own dishonor. But reality had its own surprises waiting. Because when those ships reached the American coast, Something happened that shook even the most hardened beliefs. 2. The journey across the Pacific. Fear on the ships. For most Japanese prisoners, the journey into captivity began not with a camp, but with a ship. After being captured on islands scattered across the Pacific, Saipan, Guadalcanal, Tarawa, they were herded onto U.S. transport vessels. The steel hulls were hot, the holds crowded, and the air filled with silence broken only by whispers. They did not know where they were going. Rumors swept through the groups. Some said Hawaii. Others believed they would be dumped into the ocean halfway across. Many were convinced they were being shipped to America itself, a place described by propaganda as cruel, foreign, and merciless. On deck, under guard, they looked out at the endless ocean and thought of home. Some wept quietly. Others clung to the only thing they thought certain, that the Americans would use them as examples, perhaps torture them to send a message to Japan. The voyage was not just a physical passage, but a mental torment, every wave echoing with questions. Would they ever see Japan again? Would their families even want them back? And yet, the reality on these ships often contrasted sharply with expectation. Conditions were strict, but surprisingly orderly. U.S. naval crews, following regulations, distributed food, sometimes rice or bread, sometimes even fruit, though meager by American standards. Water was rationed carefully, but it was clean. Wounded men were treated by medics, bandages replaced, infections noted. To the prisoners, this was confusing. Why care for men you had just fought with bullets and bombs? Why not let them rot? A captured soldier later remembered the shock of seeing an American corpsman kneel down to check his fever. "I thought he was mocking me," the man wrote years later, "but he handed me water and moved on. No word, just duty." The lesson of this journey is subtle. Sometimes the fear of the unknown is heavier than the chains themselves. The voyage across the Pacific was filled with dread, but it also planted the first seeds of doubt. If the Americans truly meant only cruelty, why had they given food? Why bandage wounds? Still, the questions had no answers yet. The men remained braced for humiliation, for beatings, for hunger. They carried their terror with them as the ships pushed eastward, day after day, until finally one morning the outlines of a distant coast rose against the horizon. 3. First steps on American soil. A contradictory welcome. When the ships finally docked, silence fell among the prisoners. This was the moment they had dreaded since capture, stepping into the enemy's homeland. They braced for humiliation. Many expected to be spit on, struck, perhaps paraded through angry crowds. In their minds, America was a land of victors who would delight in their suffering. But the reality was strangely different. As they disembarked, guards barked commands, but the tone was firm, not sadistic. Men were lined up, counted, and marched down orderly ramps. Instead of chaos, there was paperwork. Officers recorded names, ranks, and identification. Fingerprints were taken, photographs snapped. To the Japanese, this felt less like conquest and more like bureaucracy. Then came the first contradiction that lodged deeply in their memories. Food. At the very edge of their shame, expecting starvation, they were handed rations, a slice of bread, sometimes with butter, coffee in steaming cups, even meat on occasion. For men who had survived on handfuls of rice or jungle roots, this was beyond belief. Some prisoners refused at first, thinking it a trick. Others ate cautiously, glancing at the guards, waiting for the blow that never came. One former prisoner later recalled that the first bite of warm bread was the moment his world cracked open. He had been taught Americans were savages. Yet here he was, eating a meal served by the very enemy he had been ordered to hate. The surroundings deepened the confusion. Beyond the fences and barbed wire, the camps they marched into did not resemble the prisons of nightmare. Rows of wooden barracks stretched in neat lines, like military training posts. There were kitchens, recreation grounds, even signs for libraries. The order of it all, every post painted, every walkway marked, clashed violently with the chaos of jungle warfare they had just left behind. Here lies the quiet lesson. Cruelty is not the only language of power. The Americans wielded order itself like a weapon, and for men who had been told to expect nothing but violence, that order was far more unsettling. Still, fear lingered. Was this kindness only temporary? Would the true cruelty come later? For now, the prisoners walked into barracks with food in their stomachs and confusion in their minds. 4. Camp architecture, barbed wire and baseball fields. The first thing they noticed was the wire. Tall fences stitched the horizon, their shadows falling across packed earth. Watchtowers stood at the corners like quiet metronomes of authority. It looked, at a glance, exactly like the prison they had feared. But once inside, another picture came into focus. The camp was arranged like a grid, simple, logical, unmistakably military. Long wooden barracks sat in neat rows, each with numbers stenciled at the door. Gravel paths cut between them like straight rivers. A mess hall squatted at the center of each block, its chimney breathing out the familiar smell of hot food. Near the entrance were the administrative huts, a place for roll calls, records, schedules tacked to a board with thumbtacks. There was a rhythm to it all, a choreography built into lumber and nails. Farther in, they found the spaces that didn't fit their nightmares. A low building with sinks and showers, a laundry shed with steaming tubs and racks, a small room set aside for a library magazines with photographs, English books stacked spine out, dictionaries passed hand to hand. In another corner, a field raked smooth, chalk lines bright against the dust, a baseball diamond. Some camps had soccer goals knocked together from scrap timber, others hammered planks into benches along the baseline. On quiet afternoons, the thud of a mitt or the crack of a bat drifted across the compound, and for a moment the barbed wire seemed very far away. To men who had spent months in jungle caves and slit trenches, the geometry of the place was jarring. There was a building for sleeping and another for eating, a place to wash, a place to read, a place to stand in line and be counted. In their own garrisons, shortage turned every day into improvisation, sewing a shirt with fishbone needles, boiling water in a shell casing, shaving with a dull blade in a tin cup. Here, function had addresses, needs had rooms, and the camp's layout served purposes beyond comfort. The straight avenues and clear sight lines made roll call fast and escapes difficult. Fire breaks between barracks kept a spark from becoming a disaster. Fences and towers drew the hard boundary. Order on the inside kept everything else from fraying. The Americans had built a machine of routine and then asked their enemies to live inside it. One afternoon, a group of prisoners watched a game from the fence line. Dust rose with each slide into second. The guard at the foul pole barely looked up. It was an ordinary scene made shocking by where it happened. They had expected cells. They had found schedules. They had expected chaos. They had found a plan. Here is the small lesson this architecture whispered. Control doesn't need a raised voice. It can be the quiet of straight lines, the certainty of a bell ringing on time, the comfort of knowing where to stand and when to move. Barbed wire announced authority. Baseball fields advertised confidence. And just beyond the diamond, another building carried a different kind of message, a painted cross over the door, windows propped for air. Inside, cabinets of gauze and bottles arranged in rows. 5. Medical care by the enemy. When the prisoners were herded toward the small buildings with painted crosses, many braced themselves. In their imagination, this was where the cruelty would finally begin, needles as torture, treatments as experiments, pain disguised as care. They had been warned that Americans were merciless, but inside, the scene unfolded differently. Medical officers in khaki coats sat behind wooden tables. Orderlies carried clipboards. One by one, men were called forward, temperatures taken, wounds unwrapped, scars and rashes examined with quiet efficiency. For soldiers who had spent weeks scratching lice in the jungle, the sight of a doctor's pen scratching notes on paper was almost as shocking as battle itself. The illnesses were many: malaria, dysentery, infected bullet wounds, jungle rot eating at the skin. American medics moved briskly. Bandages replaced dirty cloth, quinine handed out for fever, ointments applied to sores. There was no indulgence, no attempt at warmth, only method. Yet that method alone stunned the prisoners. They had expected to be abandoned. Instead, they were logged, tagged, and treated. A former POW later recalled the confusion of lying on a cot while an American nurse checked his pulse. I thought, surely he will strike me when I look away. He wrote years later, but he only wrote my name, and told me to rest. For many, this was the first time in months that anyone had cared whether they lived to see another sunrise. The difference from their own army was stark. In Japanese garrisons, a soldier too weak to march was often left behind, considered a burden. Supplies were for the fit, not the failing. Survival meant enduring sickness without complaint. To suddenly receive medicine from the enemy was more than kindness. It was a challenge to everything they believed about war and honor. The quiet lesson here is that compassion can be mechanical, yet still life-changing. The Americans did not bandage wounds out of friendship. They did it because order demanded it, because a healthy camp was easier to manage, and because Geneva Convention rules required compliance. But to the men on those cots, the motive mattered less than the result. For the first time in months, they felt the possibility of survival. As strength slowly returned, another revelation loomed. Doctors could heal wounds and tame fever, but the daily routines of camp life would demand something even harder of these men: to wash, to shave, to scrub away the grime they once wore as proof of endurance. 6. Hygiene as discipline: showers, soap, and inspections. If medicine shocked the prisoners, hygiene unsettled them even more. The Japanese army had praised endurance above all else. Dirt, sweat, even untreated wounds were seen as proof of toughness. A soldier who could march with lice in his clothes and rot in his boots was celebrated as strong. Cleanliness was a luxury for civilians, not warriors. So when American guards handed out soap and towels and ordered every man to bathe, confusion rippled through the barracks. The showers were large, communal, with pipes that hissed and poured steaming water. Men stepped under reluctantly, their bodies rigid, expecting humiliation. But what came instead was sensation hot water loosening the grime of months, the sharp scent of American soap filling their lungs, the weight of dirt sliding away. Some found the experience almost unbearable, as if being scrubbed clean erased the scars of their sacrifice. Others described it years later as their first true moment of relief since capture. One remembered the sting of soap on his skin and admitted it felt like waking from a nightmare. And the rules went further. Guards inspected them afterward. Beards and stubble were not tolerated. Razors were issued, sometimes safety razors the men had never seen before, and instructions were given on how to use them. To appear neat, shaven, and tidy was not optional, it was enforced. Inspections lined men up in rows, their faces scanned like soldiers on parade. At first, many resisted. They had grown accustomed to ragged beards and grime as part of their warrior image. Some officers warned their men not to grow soft under these routines, but discipline pressed on, firm and unyielding. Soon, every barrack smelled faintly of soap, and hair grew shorter with each inspection. The small lesson hidden here was simple yet profound. Order could be taught not only with rifles, but with rituals. By washing, shaving, and trimming their nails, the prisoners were forced to live by American standards of discipline. Cleanliness, they discovered, was not weakness, it was control, disguised as routine. For the Americans, hygiene prevented disease. For the prisoners, it became a quiet lesson in how power could reshape even the smallest habits of daily life. And as they adapted, another surprise awaited them, one that felt both intimate and humiliating at first. Because within the camp, there was a place where clippers buzzed, mirrors shone, and chairs stood ready. 7. The barber's chair. Transformation and humiliation. If soap and razors unsettled the prisoners, the barber's chair felt almost surreal. Inside many American camps, a small building or corner of a barrack had been set aside as a barbershop. There were mirrors on the wall, brushes and combs laid out in neat rows, and the steady hum of electric clippers, a sound some men had never heard before. At first, stepping into that chair was a moment of tension. Soldiers sat stiffly, their hands clenched on their knees, uncertain if the buzzing blades were tools of humiliation. In Japanese tradition, hair carried weight. Long, unkempt hair was proof of hardship endured. Wild beards could mark a warrior's struggle. To have it trimmed by the enemy's hand felt like surrender inside surrender. But the procedure was quick, mechanical, and almost gentle. Hair fell in clumps to the floor. Faces were revealed again after months of hiding beneath grime. For many, the reflection in the mirror was shocking. They no longer saw the jungle-worn fighters they had become, but something closer to the men they once were: sons, brothers, workers. Humanity, in a strange way, peeked back through neat lines and tidy cuts. Some prisoners even found a strange sense of relief. Short hair meant fewer lice, less itching, less sickness. The heat of summer felt easier to bear. And in time, the barber's shop became a kind of quiet social space. While waiting their turn, men whispered rumors of the war's progress or chuckled softly at a comrade's new look. Ironically, some even began competing over whose haircut looked sharper, as if style could survive inside barbed wire. A few camps even recruited barbers from among the prisoners themselves. Men who had once trimmed hair in Osaka or Tokyo now found themselves holding scissors again, shaping the heads of fellow captives instead of neighborhood customers. In those moments, they touched a fragment of civilian life they thought long lost. The lesson here was unsettling yet undeniable. Even appearance could be controlled. By unifying the look of thousands of prisoners, the Americans reduced defiance and reinforced discipline. A neat haircut was not just hygiene, it was conformity, order written across every face. And just as their hair was tamed, another shock awaited them in the barracks: uniforms. For men used to rags and tattered gear, being dressed in clean garments marked PW would strip away the last symbols of their old identity while also giving them, paradoxically, a strange sense of equality. 8. Tailoring and clothing. From rags to uniformity. When the Japanese prisoners first arrived, most still wore the remnants of their battlefield uniforms. Shirts torn at the seams, trousers patched with scraps, boots falling apart. The clothes carried the smell of salt, blood, and jungle rot. Each rip and stain told the story of hardship endured. But in the camps, those rags were quickly taken away. In their place, prisoners were issued simple garments, denim or cotton, sturdy and plain, with the large letters PW stenciled boldly across the back. To many, this was humiliating. Officers who once wore polished insignia now looked no different from privates. The uniforms stripped away the hierarchy that had defined their world. Rank and pride reduced to equal folds of cloth. Yet the shock did not end there. American camps also organized tailoring shops. Here, torn clothing was collected, repaired, and returned with precise stitches. Some prisoners stared in disbelief at the sight of a neatly mended sleeve. Why would the enemy waste time patching the clothes of captives? In their own army, uniforms were expected to last until they disintegrated, and raggedness was considered a badge of endurance. In time, many discovered that these tailoring rooms were more than practical, they were symbols of order. Every garment was logged, sewn, redistributed. The system itself was a message. In America, scarcity was not endured, it was managed. And for some prisoners, the tailoring shop became an unexpected refuge. Men who had once worked in textile factories or neighborhood shops in Osaka or Tokyo found themselves holding needles again, now sewing under electric light. A soldier who had been reduced to digging trenches might rediscover his old trade, stitching seams, adjusting hems, or even making curtains for a barrack window. These small tasks gave a sense of purpose in captivity, a reminder of civilian life hidden beneath the soldier's shell. There was another lesson woven into every thread. Clothing could both erase and restore identity. Stripped of insignia, the prisoners lost their visible rank, but in clean, mended uniforms they gained back a small measure of dignity. No longer draped in rags, they looked less like broken remnants of war and more like men again. And yet, the Americans were not done demonstrating their systems of order. Beyond tailoring lay another service even more astonishing: laundry. To men accustomed to scrubbing shirts in muddy rivers or not at all, the sight of industrial machines churning out piles of clean clothing would feel like stepping into another world. 9. Industrial laundry, the shock of machines and clean sheets. If the barbers and tailors had already challenged Japanese expectations, the laundry rooms seemed almost unbelievable. For soldiers who had spent months in the tropics wearing the same uniforms until they rotted from their bodies, the idea of clothing collected, washed, and returned on schedule felt like something from another world. Laundry days in the camps followed a rhythm. Prisoners were ordered to hand over their garments in marked bags, each tagged with a number. Trucks or carts carried the bundles to central facilities, where the work of transformation began. Inside, great machines clanked and churned, clouds of steam filling the air. The smell of hot water and soap hung heavy, a smell many had not known since leaving home. Men who had once scrubbed shirts in muddy rivers now watched through open doors as mechanical drums spun their clothing by the hundreds. It was not just the speed that shocked them, but the scale. A task that once devoured hours of labor in the jungle was accomplished here by steel and steam in minutes. For prisoners raised in scarcity, this felt almost decadent. When the laundry was returned, the shock deepened. Uniforms came back clean, pressed, and neatly folded. Even bed linens, sheets, and blankets were washed on rotation. Some prisoners later wrote that the first night they lay on crisp sheets, they could not sleep. The softness, the faint scent of detergent, the absence of lice and vermin, it was too alien, too far from the mud floors of caves and foxholes. For others, the laundry became labor itself. Assigned to folding tables and heavy presses, they learned to sort piles of garments with industrial precision. Men who had once carried rifles now spent hours smoothing creases into uniforms under the hiss of steam irons. Strange as it seemed, some took pride in mastering the machines, discovering order in tasks that dulled the chaos of memory. The lesson hidden in these rooms was as sharp as the smell of soap. Discipline is not only about weapons, but about systems. For the Americans, clean clothing prevented disease, lowered tension, and kept the camp orderly. For the Japanese, it revealed a philosophy entirely different from their own strength, not through hardship, but through efficiency and abundance. And yet, laundry was only one part of this broader design. For the Americans, every system, food, hygiene, medical care, labor fit into a larger purpose: to keep thousands of captives controlled, occupied, and useful. 10. Work, labor, and productivity in captivity. Once the routines of hygiene and clothing had taken hold, the camps introduced another layer of order: work. For the Americans, prisoners were not meant to sit idle behind barbed wire. Idleness bred unrest, and thousands of men with nothing to do could quickly turn to trouble. Work gave structure, work gave control. And, when possible, it even gave back to the war effort. Assignments varied depending on the camp's location. In the Midwest and South, prisoners were sent to harvest crops or tend fields. Japanese soldiers who once clutched rifles now held shovels, their days measured by the rhythm of farm labor. In forested regions, they were tasked with cutting timber, stacking logs that would feed American industry. Inside the camps, men repaired barracks, cooked in kitchens, or staffed the very laundry and tailoring shops that had astonished them only weeks before. For many, this return to labor was jarring. They had been trained as warriors, not workers. Yet some discovered a strange comfort in the routine. A man who had once worked in a factory in Osaka before the war might find himself sewing again, his hands moving almost automatically over fabric. Another, who had grown up on a farm, might recall childhood days as he tilled rows of American soil. In captivity, echoes of civilian life resurfaced in unexpected ways. There were, of course, tensions. Some officers warned that embracing this labor dulled the warrior's spirit, that working for the enemy was a second surrender. But others understood the quiet truth. Work made the days bearable. It filled the emptiness that gnawed at men confined behind wire. Diaries later revealed that those given tasks often endured captivity with more strength than those left idle. The lesson here was clear: structure can transform despair into survival. By putting prisoners to work, the Americans reduced the chance of rebellion and offered men a routine that steadied their minds. It was not generosity, it was management. But for many captives, it provided a rhythm that helped them endure months and years far from home. And this system of labor fit into something even larger. Every task, from folding laundry to cutting timber, was part of a design that reached far beyond the fence lines. America was not only feeding its enemies, it was showcasing its power, its adherence to law, and its ability to manage thousands with precision. 11. Propaganda, Red Cross, and American image. Beyond fences and guard towers, the camps served another purpose, one far larger than feeding or disciplining prisoners. They were a stage, and the audience extended well beyond America's borders. The United States had learned from the mistakes of World War I, when poor treatment of prisoners had sparked criticism and unrest. This time, the government was determined to show the world and especially neutral observers that it upheld the Geneva Convention. Every ration, every inspection, every clean uniform doubled as a message. America was not only powerful on the battlefield, but also lawful, humane, and disciplined in captivity. The International Red Cross played a key role in this theatre. Inspectors visited camps, toured barracks, and interviewed prisoners. They noted the facilities, the barber shops, the laundry rooms, the medical wards. Reports were written, circulated, and eventually reached both Washington and Geneva. For the Japanese prisoners, the presence of outsiders with notebooks and cameras added another layer of strangeness. They were being seen not just as captives, but as proof. Propaganda worked in quieter ways too. Photographs of healthy-looking prisoners sometimes appeared in American newspapers, reassuring citizens that their country treated enemies with dignity, even while sons fought and died overseas. The image mattered. If America could clothe and feed its enemies, it reinforced the idea that its industrial might and moral compass were unshakable. The contrast with Japanese treatment of Allied POWs was stark. News of the Bataan Death March or the horrors of the Burma Railway reached American homes and hardened public opinion. By comparison, the careful order of U.S. camps became part of a moral high ground, a statement that America, unlike its enemy, kept faith with international law. Prisoners themselves felt the pressure of this theatre. Some recognized that their very cleanliness, their orderly rows at roll call, were performances for inspectors. Others resented it, sensing that their shaved faces and pressed uniforms had become propaganda tools. And yet, many quietly admitted that these same routines made survival easier, even if the motives behind them were complex. The lesson is subtle. Sometimes the appearance of dignity is as important as dignity itself. By maintaining order before the eyes of the world, America strengthened its image, and in doing so, it also, paradoxically, gave its prisoners conditions that spared them the worst fates of war. But propaganda and image were only part of the story. Beneath them ran something deeper, a demonstration of America's sheer industrial and logistical power. For the Japanese, who had lived through scarcity, the abundance of their captors was perhaps the most unforgettable shock of all. 12. Industrial and logistical power. Abundance as a weapon. For Japanese prisoners, the most enduring shock was not a single meal or a clean shirt. It was the realization that America's strength flowed not only from its soldiers, but from its systems. Everywhere they looked, abundance revealed itself. The laundry machines churning endlessly, the stacks of uniforms repaired and folded, the steady stream of rations arriving without interruption, hot water running reliably through showers, medical supplies distributed with clockwork efficiency. None of this happened by chance. It was the result of a nation whose factories and farms could sustain both its own armies across two oceans and its enemies held behind fences. For men who had lived through the collapse of Japanese supply lines, the contrast was unbearable. On Pacific Islands, they had eaten roots and insects. Ammunition ran short, uniforms fell apart, and even drinking water was rationed. Now, in captivity, they found themselves clothed, fed, and treated according to schedules set months in advance. Some realized, quietly, that this was the true face of American power, not only bombs and rifles, but the ability to organize, to provide, to keep the machine running. In the words of one former prisoner, "It was not their cruelty that frightened me, but their endless supply of everything." And this abundance carried a message. By caring for prisoners, America did more than follow the Geneva Convention. It demonstrated to the world, and to its captives, that it could afford to. It was a form of soft power, a statement that dignity and discipline were not luxuries, but products of strength. The lesson here is simple but profound. Victory in war is not won only by courage or sacrifice, but by systems that outlast hardship. Clean sheets, hot meals, working machines, these were as much symbols of American might as tanks or aircraft carriers. For Japanese prisoners, that realization settled deep. It unsettled their old beliefs about endurance as the highest form of strength, and it lingered long after the war, shaping how they remembered captivity and how they viewed the enemy they had once feared.